Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me and see me. My name is David Dewing, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Frederick Parker Lectures of 2021. This is actually the 22nd series of lectures that we've done. Of course, it's the first one we've ever done online, and we hope it'll all go well. The nice thing about having an online lecture is that we've got something like 250 people registered for this lecture this evening. I mean, normally we would have about 100 people coming to a physical lecture at the Furniture Makers Hall. And then, of course, they're followed by a lovely dinner. We're not being able to do the dinner this evening, but we do have lots of people joining us, and that's a wonderful thing. So a warm welcome to all of you, and I hope we have an interesting and an enjoyable evening. So first of all, a couple of housekeeping points. You, the audience, are going to remain muted and with your videos off. That keeps the quality of the audio and the visual content as high as possible. If you have questions, and I hope you do, during and after the lecture, use the question and answer, the Q&A symbol at the bottom of your screen, and type your question into that. And when the lecture's over, I'll come back onto the screen and I'll be reading out the questions, as many as we can handle, for Gina to answer. Please note that we're recording the lecture for recording from now, actually, I think, and it will be available online on the Furniture Makers website in a day or two. Another point, just to remind you all, those who don't know much about the Frederick Parker collection, I'm going to give a short introduction in a minute to the collection. But there's a group called the Friends of the Frederick Parker Collection, and many of you, I hope, are listening in this evening. And you'll also know that if you're a friend, that you're automatically entered into our champagne draw every year. This year, the draw is going to be handled by Martin Jordan, who you will all know, but he's chairman of the Friends, was chairman of Parker Knoll, and is a past master of the Furniture Makers Company. So he will do the draw at the end of our second lecture, which is going to be at the same time next week, 6 o'clock on the 1st of April, when Luke Honey will be giving his lecture on coronation chairs. So after Luke's given his lecture, Martin will come on and draw the winners of this year's champagne. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Gina Pierce, who's going to be speaking this evening. And just before that, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to Frederick Parker and the collection. So let's just move on a slide. So the Frederick Parker collection comprises around 200 chairs. They date mainly from the mid-17th to the mid-17th century to the present. They're mostly mid-17th century to about 1820, so 1650, say, to 1820. That was the period that Frederick Parker were particularly interested in. In addition to the chair collection, there is an extensive archive covering 100 years of furniture manufacturing, both by Frederick Parker and Sons, and then by Parker Knoll. The collection itself is owned by the Furniture Makers Company, and it's on long-term loan to the London Metropolitan University, where it's available to visit and study. At least it would be in normal times. Frederick Parker, it all begins with him. He was born in 1845. His father was a master cabinet maker in Finsbury in North London. But Frederick set up his own company in 1869. So we think about the Frederick Parker Company business beginning in 1869, and it grew rapidly into one of the leading manufacturers in the East End of London, making high quality reproduction cabinet work and a lot of upholstered furniture. And he was joined by his 4 sons, and in 1898 the whole family and the whole company moved from East London up to High Wycombe, which was a very brave move in those days because not very many companies had done that, moving out of London. And like High Wycombe was actually a centre then for making Windsor chairs only. They didn't do upholstery really. So Frederick Parker had to then train a new workforce and set up a new factory. But actually it was a very clever move, and he did very well out of it. They also opened a shop in Oxford, just off Oxford Street, And this is one of the signs from the shop showing Frederick Parker and Sons. This was in Newman Street, and they opened that in 1903. Again, a very unusual step for a manufacturer in those days to open a shop and start to sell their own furniture. Normally, they'd be selling as a wholesaler through to retailers who were the big companies like Marshall and Snellgrove and Liberties and other companies, Maples, all those companies, the retailer, the big department stores. So Frederick Parker had their own shop from a very early date. They were making furniture, reproduction furniture, which was going into some of the big prestigious ocean liners that were crossing the Atlantic, particularly Cunard's ships. And these they furnished in a sort of grand English country house style, which you can see here. This is the Aquitania, the first class lounge, photographed in 1914. And this sort of style was apparently exactly what the affluent English and particularly the American passengers liked to see, a bit of old England. But actually, reproduction furniture of all kinds was very popular in the Edwardian period, through into the Second World War, really. Lots of furniture that was being made by all the companies in London were making styled furniture based on 17th and 18th and early 19th century English furniture. And the Frederick Parker Company was supplying the royal family. They were supplying embassies around the world. They were supplying hotels and prestigious clients, including for the Viceroy's Palace in New Delhi, and they made Emperor Haile Selassie's throne. So they had some very big orders, and were a very successful firm making good quality, high quality upholstered furniture and cabinet work. What they would do is to collect furniture and then make copies of it. So when we come to talk about the collection, the chair collection was formed by Frederick Parker and his sons between around 1900 and 1930. And they bought furniture from the antiques trade in London, mostly from Soho. And they kept meticulous records of what they bought and how much it cost and where they bought it from. And then they would use the furniture. Sometimes they'd make adaptations to it to make it more suitable for commercial production. But they'd use the chairs and antiques to make reproductions. And so what we have in terms of the collection is not a museum collection at all, but a collection that was formed for commercial purposes to help the company to develop ranges of period style reproduction furniture, which were then suitable for sale to the upper middle classes and the top of the trade. So in a way, the collection is unique because it's a snapshot of what the antique trade in London was selling, and not all of it was what it purported to be. Quite a lot of it had been adapted, altered, faked, done up by using parts from several different chairs to make one. So in that sense, it's a very interesting collection. It's also very interesting because also it shows what Frederick Parker and Sons thought would be commercially viable for their market in the 1920s and 30s. So back to the Parker Knoll story, Frederick Parker story. In 1928, they formed a very important partnership with Willy Knoll, who was a German engineer who'd invented a tension spring. And you can see, if you can follow my cursor on here, this is the tension spring. There's a little symbol here, and there's a frame here with the tension springs across it. And you can see the chair there with a whole clump of weights sitting on it to prove how strong they were. So this was a very different way of doing upholstered seating. So you stretch the springs across, and then they provide the springing, and then you put a cushion on top of that. So it was a completely new concept, and Frederick Parker and Sons were very clever, really, to take this on and to take a big risk with it and develop a whole new range of furniture around something which was new to the public. And so they launched a new range in 1931 under the new name of Parker Knoll. But this was modern, affordable furniture. This wasn't reproduction furniture. They were aiming at a completely different market. So it was a very radical change for them into a new form of furniture, new technology, new market. And they made these tension springs part of their furniture range right through into the 1960s and 70s. And here you can see it on the underside of a Parker Knoll chair made it under the utility scheme with the CC41 mark that you'll probably recognize. And here's a typical chair from the 1960s. In fact, it's from 1958 actually, but it's a Parker Knoll made these sort of wing armchairs, which were termed fireside chairs, and they were pretty much their sort of trademark signature chairs right through into the 70s and 80s, and came associated with old people's chairs largely, I think. But they produced a very wide range of furniture. And the most successful one in the 1960s and 70s was this one, the Norton recliner, which was a recliner based on an idea about reclining chairs, which was American, but taken to a much more advanced level. And this was a luxury chair, cost a lot of money, but people really were keen to buy them, and they got snapped up. And was one of their very successful lines that did really well in the 1970s. But this was the kind of the Indian summer of the furniture trade in England and the UK. The big slump in the economy in the 1980s brought about a whole change to the whole industry, and a lot of companies went bust or had to be merged with others. And actually, Parker Knoll did reasonably well by gathering up some of the smaller companies into a group called the Cornwell Parker Group, and that survived until it was bought out in 2000, first by Silent Night and then by Sofa Brands International. But the brand Parker Knoll still goes on. They're still making high quality upholstery business furniture up in Sheffield, and they're one of the leading brands in UK furniture. So back to the archive and the chair collection. The chair collection, in normal times, they can be seen at the Special Collections Department of the London Metropolitan University in Old Castle Street. In normal times, we've had visits there from lots of groups of school children, from students, from adult groups, and from individuals studying for their own research. And this is a group of school children going through some of the archive boxes, where you can see they've got albums full of fabric samples. It's an archive of over 600 boxes, which includes business and financial records, photographs and advertising material, designs and sketches and fabric samples and reference books. It's an amazingly full and comprehensive collection, which spans something like 150 years worth of furniture manufacturing. And the chair collection, 200 chairs, the original Frederick Parker collection of mainly 17th and 18th century and early 19th century chairs has been added to in the recent years, in the last 20 years, adding 20th century chairs, making it a comprehensive collection looking at the way English chair design has changed over 350 years. And it's a fascinating collection with lots of interesting aspects to it in terms of what the antiques trade was like in the 19th century, and what Frederick Parker were interested in terms of furniture for their market. So I hope that's been a useful brief introduction for those of you who haven't come across the Frederick Parker collection very much before. You can find more information about us on our website and on the London Metropolitan University's website as well. So now on to the main event, because the main event is that we've got a lecture this evening given by Gina Pierce. And Gina Pierce, let's go to the wrong slide, go to the blank slide. Gina Pierce is a specialist in interior design and textile design. She took her MA in textile design at Central St Martin's, and she's practiced as a freelance designer and is senior lecturer in textile design at London Metropolitan University. But she's now undertaking a PhD, and she's studying the furnishing fabrics used by Frederick Parker and Parker Knoll in the 1945 to 1955 period, using, of course, the Frederick Parker archive. So this is the first time that the archive has been researched in such detail at PhD level, and we're naturally very excited to see what Gina has discovered. Her lecture is appropriately titled, "The Archive is Alive, Parker Knoll Furnishing Fabrics." So over to you, Gina. Thank you very much.
Hello, hopefully you can see and hear me now. Good evening. I'm hoping I'm coming through loud and clear and visible. As David said, this is a very odd experience of talking to the ether, but I'm sure somebody will shout if I'm not visible and I'm still on mute. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk tonight. Good evening, everyone. It's already been very interesting. It's David's talk. It's a great start there. So I'm going to now share my screen. And I hope the first slide is visible. So my talk is called The Archive is Alive. And as David said, I'm talking about the Parker Knoll, particularly tonight, the Parker Knoll collection. This, of course, will need no introduction from me. You've already had a wonderful introduction from David, but you're also a very knowledgeable audience. So I'm in fact hoping I will possibly get some information from some of you, because I'm sure there'll be those of you who know more than I do. So I'm going to talk about my research work that I've been doing as part of my PhD. I'm studying part-time, and I'm studying at University of Creative Arts in Farnham, where there is an international textile research centre. So I have a great deal of support there. And I'm looking at the Parker collection and the Parker Knoll archives specifically as my case study. And I'm looking at the time period of 1945 to the late 1950s, so just after the war, time of great social change, so a very interesting time, and time reflected in the designs that we're going to see. I will be sparing you the theory. There's an awful lot of theory in PhD. I might mention a little bit of Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, but mainly this is going to be looking at a little bit about the history of Parker Knoll during the time period I'm looking at, and then my research. So my research is practice-based, which means that I research through my own work, through what I'm producing as a method of researching. And I'm doing participatory projects as well. So, as I say, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the company of the time that I'm looking at. And my research is looking at ways that design can build connections with archives to introduce them to a wider public. So we've seen that they are fantastic resources for education, and there's a lot of that going on already, that university students, school children, groups come in to see the collections. So I'm looking at ways that archives can perhaps reach a wider public and be used for other types of projects, because their archives are unlike museums in that they're not on public view all the time. You need to make an appointment to go and see them. So unless you have a special reason, unless you are a researcher, you're unlikely to just visit. So we have all this information, this wonderful furniture, fabrics, design work, publicity leaflets like this one here. And we really don't want them to languish unseen. We want them to be shared. So this is what I've been looking at with my research. So a little bit about me. I'm a textile designer and lecturer at London Metropolitan University. I started as a lecturer at London Guildhall University, which was in the building Commercial Road, which was originally the London College of Furniture, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and that's where I originally studied. So I've been lecturing since about 1998, I think, so for over 20 years anyway. But this slide here is a project that I organised using the Spitalfield silks, which are kept in the archives of the Museum of London. And the Spitalfield silks were produced by the Huguenots who came over from France in the 17th century. And they settled around the country, but most notably in Spitalfields. And they were expert weavers. They produced beautiful fabrics. So I invited a group of fashion and textile designers from around the East End to have a tour of the archive with the curator, and then to produce new work using their own processes, but based on the archive, on the textiles, but not copying them, but not replicating them, using them as inspiration. And it was a very successful exhibition, and they produced some wonderful outcomes. As you can see here, we had in the centre there, 3D printed garment, hand embroidery, and as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, a latex crinoline. So it was a very varied exhibition, but it was where I really started thinking about how archives can inspire creativity. So my interest in Parker Knoll was really piqued by this storeroom of boxes, and this is when they were in Commercial Road, before they were housed in their wonderful home that they're in at the moment in Special Collections in Aldgate. And my research started, as I say, with how these archives could be used, and this idea of inspiring creative projects. And I was particularly inspired by the fabric sample books. So you can see one of these on the right. This is one of 7 fabric books. And I found, courtesy of John Kitching, that these would be the guard books. So they're keeping a record of the textiles used for the upholstery. And these really captured my imagination. The fact that there's so little of them is very intriguing. And there is a little bit of information with these early ones, but it's still quite minimal. But I think these were particularly interesting to me because they were printed, and I'm a printed designer. And the printed linens, so they start the very late 1940s, early 50s. And the utility scheme is still in place at this time. So these linens were cheap to produce, cheaper than the woven fabrics, and the public loved them. So I read Take a Seat, the book by Stephen Bland about the history of Parker Knoll, which I've subsequently found out was quite a communal effort with others contributing. And I began to realise that there hasn't really been any other book written about Parker Knoll or Parker Collection. There's been very little academic study. And Parker Knoll hasn't really been featured in any major exhibitions. And I began to wonder why. I began to think this was an opportunity to look at one of the most important companies, I think, furniture companies of the 20th century, a really major company, huge sales. And I thought it was so interesting that Parker Knoll particularly good at reading the public mood and responding to what the public wanted, and that they sort of reflected something intrinsically British. So here we see the logo introduced when the first sprung chairs, as David was saying, in the 1930s. And this new method for constructing upholstered chairs. So it was really quite revolutionary for the time, sort of a quiet revolution. So according to Stephen Bland, the public found the first models of these chairs rather too austere, with low backs and wooden arms. So the man on the spring, the left, was introduced as an advertising campaign to show the public the structure and to show that they were comfortable, but also very innovative. And this advertising campaign was similarly innovative in that it was directly to the public, and Parker Knoll were one of the first companies to do this, to speak directly to the public through advertising. Now, these chairs are from the 1930s. Now, I would like some of the knowledgeable people out there to let me know if these were, they're called Parker Knoll, so I'm assuming they have got the tension springing. And I think this is what's so interesting, that this very traditional outside is covering this very innovative interior. And this is at a time in the 1930s when modernism and the Bauhaus was arising in Europe, and styles were coming from Scandinavia. But it does seem that in Britain there was very little appetite for this modernist aesthetic. There was Heels in London who was selling some what we think of now as modern as contemporary furniture, but really to quite a small number of people. And the general public were really buying comfort and tradition. So this page, I think, is quite revealing. In the top right, there's one offering of a steel chair dated 1937, a definite nod towards the 1920s tubular steel chair designed by Marcel Breuer, but not the style that Parker Knoll became associated with or known for. And it's not the only what we call now a modernist style sort of furniture that Parker Knoll tried. There were other models, but there is record that they really didn't sell. And I think this reflects a divergence that occurred in the 1930s and continued for much of the 20th century, and perhaps up to the 1980s, really, that there was a modernist aesthetic pioneered and championed by really what you could call a small metropolitan elite. But the general public preferred these traditional styles. And I think we have to remember that this reflects the fact that before the war, the huge majority of the British public were living in very old housing stock. Or if they were in new homes, these would most likely reference a historic style. So like the half-timbered houses of 1930s suburbia. And before the war, very few had modern appliances, and most still had coal fires for heating. So it was only in the late 1940s when more contemporary homes were built following the huge amount of bomb damage that had taken place that the housing stock really started to change. So, as you know, during the Second World War, the Board of Trade introduced the utility scheme in 1942 with an announcement in the press that they would, quote, produce specifications for furniture of good, sound construction in simple but agreeable designs. And there started the most restrictive regime for furniture production ever implemented. The utility scheme was stricter on furniture, sort of more than any other area. So the reality was this range of mainly plain, quite austere furniture with very limited colours for upholstery fabric. And commentators have remarked that there was a clearly articulated desire to influence public taste and curtail the making of reproduction traditional styles, and this was intrinsic to the scheme. The Council of Industrial Design had been established in 1944, and this was to, quote, promote by all practicable means the improvement of design in the products of British industry. The furniture maker Gordon Russell became one of the advisory committee on utility furniture, and he had been an outspoken advocate before the war for simplicity and for fitness for purpose. Now, a Board of Trade memorandum states that there is a chance here during our period of greatest economy of influencing popular taste towards good construction in simple, agreeable design to the benefit of our after-the-war homes. But this utility furniture wasn't popular with the public, and the lack of enthusiasm for the minimal styles appears to have been shared by some of the trade press at the time. When an exhibition to show the public the first 28 pieces of furniture, of this utility furniture, opened at the Building Centre in London in 1942, the press were critical of the pieces, with the cabinet maker and the Architects' Journal labelling the designs as very ugly. So the chair in the centre was one of the Parker Knoll utility designs, seen here with replacement upholstery. And the strict rationing of furniture came to an end in 1948, with the utility scheme continuing in some form until 1952. And Parker Knoll started to produce chairs within the scheme, built from apparently a selection of random parts covered in whatever materials could be found. And these included heavy canvas from discarded war contracts, some patterned, most plain, dyed in the most outrageous orange, green or vivid blue, and this was used for upholstery. And the chairs sold very well, and sadly there doesn't seem to be any samples of these in the fabric books, and I can't see images of this furniture with these garish colours, in colour anyway. Now, after the war, in 1946, the Council of Industrial Design organised Britain Can Make It exhibition to boost exports and show that Britain was back after the war ready for business. Selection was by the Council of Industrial Design, including the furniture designer Gordon Russell. The style of furniture, products and furnishing was edited to include only those of which the Council approved to be suitable, and over 2/3 were rejected. This rigorous selection excluded anything deemed to have superfluous ornament. But the exhibition stretched over the entire ground floor of the Victoria and Albert Museum, displaying over 5,000 exhibits, and was very popular with the public. They'd been living with rationing so long, they desperately wanted to see something new. And over 1.5 million people attended. The display was room sets set up as furnishings of imaginary households with from different social and occupational backgrounds. And there was a definite aim of democratising good design. Parker Knoll were there. They were allocated a place, although it sounds from the description as though it might have been a corridor. It just described in the catalogue as furniture in way through, from furniture section to furnished rooms section. But there they showed 6 easy chairs, PK 118. But less than 40% of the products at the show were actually available to buy to the public, The rest were prototypes, or they were designed for export only. And the exhibition became popularly known as Britain Can't Have It. Now, after this exhibition, the much more well-known exhibition, the Festival of Britain, was held in 1951. But I can't find any evidence that Parker Knoll exhibited there. If anybody knows different, I would love to hear about it. But my hunch is that perhaps they were considered too traditional, and so they weren't included. Anyway, on the right, the style you see there is looking much more like what we think of as mid-century. It's 1952, and it's still a utility chair. So this is called the Langford, model number PK733. So the public and Parker Knoll both gradually adapted to this more streamlined look for their armchairs and their fireside chairs. Although as soon as the utility restrictions were lifted, Parker Knoll also produced the more fully upholstered armchairs. So Parker Knoll were innovative with their construction, resourceful with materials, aware of what the public wanted. So they really disguised quite a radical construction within this traditional upholstery. And I think this is sort of a reflection of the British character that is perhaps independent thinking, and will adapt to new ideas, but on their own terms. And this was very much providing what the public wanted. And I think that reaching out to a public in the same way that I'm using this as a sort of a model for my research, in the way that I hope to be reaching out to the public. So returning here to the fabric sample books in the archive. So this page is from 1950, and you can see that despite the attempts of the Council of Industrial Design, the traditional wovens, the florals are still going strong 4 years after the exhibition. So there's not much minimalism. There's a couple of plain weaves in the corner there. And this is when Parker Knoll had started to supply directly to from the manufacturers. They'd started working directly with them, and set up Parker Knoll Textiles. So as we go through the sample books, the information provided gets less, and then labelled PKT. So this page has even less information, and is probably later on in the 50s. You can see there's just a name here, and the fabrics all had, or nearly all had, place names from around the UK. So they're quite evocative in their naming, but there's very little information. There's just the number. But we can see these brighter colours, and plainer weaves as we move into the 50s. But the traditional florals are still going strong. But this lack of information emphasised another theme for my research, and that is that regarding textiles, they're always part of something else. They're either made up into clothing or furnishings. And although textiles are part of every aspect of our lives, they're an area of manufacturing that the layperson outside of the industry really knows very little about. And the role of textile designer is often not understood, and frequently confused with fashion designer, although it's a completely separate discipline. So this led to my first participatory project, this theme, and this is what I'm going to be talking about next. So the Fabric Handover project. And looking at, again, at the linen samples, I started with these. So as I say, these were really popular with the public after the war when they wanted colour and pattern. People wanted colour in their lives, and they were cheaper to produce than the wovens. And with the utility scheme, the yarns for wovens were still in short supply. So these were printed by leading companies of the time: Warner's, Edinburgh Weavers, Gainsborough, some of whom are still in existence, but many have gone. And these are the little samples that, as I say, really drew me in, and I wanted to use them in some way. So I'm researching through my textiles as well as written theory. I'm a printer, which is why I'm particularly drawn to these. And I decided to produce a design that referenced them. So I brought the different florals together in one design, taking some elements from each, enlarged the scale and changed the colour. And I printed this length, I did a couple of lengths actually, printed onto linen in just one colour. So a PhD is about theory and testing out theory, and that's what I'm doing with the practical work. So I was interested in how the fabric would be used independent of being part of a piece or furniture and clothing. And I gave a metre of this fabric to different participants to see what they would do with it. And I asked them to do anything at all that they wanted with it. And once they'd done that, 4 weeks later, I asked them to take photographs of whatever they'd done and send them back to me. So this was sent out to not a huge amount of people, but a small number, but very varied in age and background and experience of textiles or not. And so I'm going to show you a couple of the results. So this was perhaps one of the more senior of the group, and I found that perhaps the more what I would call grown-up members of the test group responded by doing something practical or decorative, or something that was personal to them. So here it's been stretched onto a frame and decorated with old pieces of furniture. And this was, I say, a grown-up, a male, and he had it hemmed, and he uses it as a portable tablecloth. He takes it around wherever he goes and does continue to use it. However, what I found with younger participants was that they struggled, and I'm told that they had the best of intentions, but they really didn't know what to do with it. So I had 3 in this group, one late teens, a couple in their 20s, and they didn't do anything at all. And as you can see, the one on the right is still in the bag. So I think this showed a couple of things. Perhaps my theory that textiles are not recognised unless there's some knowledge behind or experience of how to use them. That perhaps the younger generation are not used to making things from scratch. And perhaps also that they express a more minimal taste and that they don't want pattern in their lives. One of the piece of good news that came out of this project was that they were all interested in knowing where the pattern came from, and would be interested in visiting the archive. So the next project I'm going to talk about is, I call the Cutting Plans project. And for this, I looked beyond the fabric samples and I found these drawings made for upholstery patterns. I thought these were really intriguing, and I used them to design a print. So this is a work in progress exhibition, and I hand screen printed a fabric. You can see the design, references, the cutting plans. And the exhibition was set up to look like a workshop. So there are screens and tools and other samples. And the exhibition was in Folkestone. And while I was there, I had some very good conversations with people reminiscing about Parker Knoll and about Parker Knoll chairs. And so many people I've met have stories about chairs that have been in their families. And I found this a great way to introduce a discussion about the archive. Everyone seems to have a story about owning a Parker Knoll, and talk affectionately about the associations with the chairs and with relatives. And there's definitely a strand of research that could be followed up there. I printed the same design digitally onto Tyvek, which is an untearable paper. And this was for an exhibition in Paris of items that were usually made from material. And I wanted to make this into a chair shape, as the chair is the iconic Parker Knoll piece of furniture. And I like the concept of creating a chair shape using the upholstery patterns in a different way from how they were originally intended. So this draws attention to the fact that this should be fabric, and hopefully makes people think about the qualities that fabric has and paper doesn't. And in making this paper cover, I very much appreciated that fabrics are much more tolerant than paper, and creases and mistakes can be ironed out. So the next project I've called the Folding Books Project. And again, I looked at other items in the archive that could inspire designs, and found books of accounts and sales records. And I was interested in showing aspects of the company life that supported design and making of the furniture. So here on the right, there's the records of a salesman who listed the chairs he sold, and it's the PK 715. So this is 1949, shown week by week, the number of orders, the cancellations, the net orders, the value, a running total of the value of the orders, the dispatched, the credits. It's the story of a working life in numbers. I found this glimpse into a salesman routine immediately gave an insight into the life of a man in 1949. And I thought it's really quite striking how this page can bring this home to us. Now on the left is information about property, and it's difficult to know the meaning, but I just like that in 1946 these records are handwritten, and the books have entries by different people with different handwriting. And I wanted to use these documents to acknowledge in some way these aspects of the company and the employees. So these were the starting point for some collages, and I hand painted out the lettering at large scale with a brush, cut them up, and made these collages as starting points. So quite a lot of my work starts with hand processes in this way. And then I take them into a digital format so that I can change the colour, scale, make repeats, as you could see with this image on the right. And once it's digital, the permutations are endless. And another project where I used the lettering again, this time with the floral fabrics added, and references to the labels. So I've created these collages, and they're sort of sketch ideas that I then went on to make into folding books. And I was very much thinking about the sample books with the fabrics in, and using that format as a concept. So I'm going to pursue this idea with a professional bookbinder, so it all looks a bit smarter. But it means that I could take them to a workshop or a school, and people could open them and unfold them, and have the feeling that the researcher has when in the archive and opens a box. And I said I'd limit the theory, but I'm going to quote a little bit of Foucault here, as he has a lot to say about archives. And Foucault wrote of being affected by his experiences with documents from centuries ago, and the archives deeply moved him. He says, because of the resonance I feel when I encounter these small lives. And I think this is what I'm aiming for with this idea of opening books, that people can have this sense of discovery. And it's one of the thrills of being a researcher in the archive, of finding sometimes the unexpected and then wanting to know more. And hopefully I have a film. So I became fascinated by this folding book format and found a very simple way to create a book from a sheet of paper. And I wanted to do another project with participants, but this was last year during one of the lockdowns. So I couldn't go into anywhere to run a workshop or to meet anyone. And I devised this very simple folding book that I could email with instructions. And there are two designs here, one based on the floral collage and one on the cutting plans designs. So I asked people to do whatever they wanted with these, and to photograph them and to send them to me. And hopefully I'll just show how simple this design was. So these are some of the examples from a range of very different participants. Some are professional designers, but most are not. A range of age groups, students, school children, and they each do something very different. Some are hand-drawn, some are done as digital artwork, and they've used different materials. So since lockdown, there's been this explosion in the amount of projects online. And I think people were much more accepting of doing a project like this. It sort of chimed with the mood of the moment. And it sort of fits with the idea of mindful colouring, and also with this idea of play, which I think many adults lose when they stop doing any kind of artwork, which I think is a shame. But this gives permission to just do a very quick time to play, and when it's something kind of very simple to do. So in my reflection on this, when writing it up for my research, I think it's about the archive being the starting point to encourage creativity and self-expression. And it doesn't have to be about learning something necessarily. But some people did ask about the archive. I had a query from someone who said that she'd looked at the Parker Knoll archive and she really couldn't see what this exercise had to do with it. So I explained about it. I explained about the books, and she said that she understood, and she did a little book, and hers was a great contribution. So it reached people in different ways with different results. And these are by some students on an access to education course who I spoke to, and they happened to be working at the time on zines, which are little magazines. They're usually very niche and very low tech, and low budget if they are produced. So the Little Books project tied in very well with this and showed it was relevant to different types of participants. Okay, I'm going to move on to now a live project, which is with the current Parker Knoll company. So this is an ongoing project with my textile students at London Metropolitan, and it's with the second year students. And I've organised previously a project with Parker Knoll, which was very successful. And they are very ready to be part of helping the students by giving feedback on their designs. And I'm very grateful for their support. It's a very useful project for the students to be studying, to look at the colour and the pattern that customers buy, and really important for them to see and understand what the customer wants from a sofa or an armchair. So something that they will keep for years, will be quite an expensive buy, and needs to fit with other furnishings that they have. So sadly, at the moment, of course, we're not allowed into the archive collection, which is a great shame for the students because they won't have that sense of independent discovery. But they have access to the digitized image from the archive, which is fantastic. And I've also taken an awful lot of photos, which they are using. And they are really enjoying this project and this experience. So it's very much a project in development at the moment, and this is a selection of some of their mood boards, and they've been encouraged to look at the archive, but also to introduce some material of their own. And here we have some very preliminary ideas and interim designs which they're working on. And as you can see, they're doing very different work. It's very individual. And they all get feedback from the designers at Parker Knoll, which is absolutely fantastic. So the students are learning an awful lot from this experience. So the final project I'm going to talk about is the Big Blanket. And this was inspired by one of the antique pieces in the archive. And this is a needlepoint seat cover. There's a detail on the right there of the section that I actually used. And again, this is an area that could be a whole separate subject for research, because some of the fabrics were inspired by these antique pieces. And I can recognize some of the florals here. However, this project was inspired, and I was looking at the work of an artist in America who made a huge artwork with 300 blankets, which were then given to homeless people. And when the blankets were all laid out together, they made up a huge image. And I wanted to try something like this using the archive. So if you look at the flowers on the right, And I created a pixel image from this embroidery, designed to be made up of 50 blankets, and each pixel, each square would represent a square on the blanket. And I decided on 50 blankets to make up this image, partly because I only had 4 months to Christmas. I wanted these to be ready for Christmas, as I wanted to do this for Crisis at Christmas, and the blankets would be given to them to give to the homeless. And partly because I needed somewhere where I could lay these out. And I knew that at that time of year it could be raining, so I needed to find somewhere inside. And actually that became one of the biggest problems, was finding where I was going to lay these out. So anyway, I started out on this project without kind of knowing how that was going to happen. And it gained momentum. It was supported by the university with a grant, so that I had interns to help me. And I recruited volunteers, and I supplied them with a plan for each blanket with colours to match to, the precise layout, and they had to provide their own yarns and fabrics. And I went to the Knit and Stitch show, and as I say, I recruited a lot of volunteers who produced the blankets using knitting, crochet and patchwork. And it became a very sociable exercise, with groups forming. I had Women's Institute groups, I had all types of different groups joining in. And as I say, one of the biggest headaches was to find somewhere where this was going to be laid out. And finally I approached Conway Hall, and they very kindly offered their hall for the afternoon for free. And these are some of the finished blankets, and you can see on the left here, I provided a label that the volunteers could put on the back so that they could see who the blanket was made by, and each person that received one would be able to read this label and see that it was made especially for them. And on the right, some of the volunteers at Crisis when the blankets arrived. So I'm now hopefully going to show a film of the blankets being assembled in Conway Hall. And this was the first time that they were actually put together and that I could see that the design worked. And now I'm hoping the film works. Okay, so I've come to the end of my presentation, and I love this. So I like to end on this leaflet. I think the advertising campaign, the promotions and leaflets are one of the joys of the archive, and definitely under-researched, another area. So I think that the archive is definitely alive. The public have shown that they would like to know more, that they'd like to use them for activities. They just need the opportunity to be introduced. There's definitely scope to do a huge amount of research into Parker Knoll, and today I've just touched on a fraction of the contents and the history. And I've hopefully shown that all archives can be used for creative purposes and projects, and contribute to culture, and the archive can live on. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gina. That was fantastic. I've got funny lighting on now. Thank you very much, Gina. I think that was a wonderfully interesting lecture, because it gave a very nice sense of your way of working and your approach to using the archive in a way which suits exactly what you want to get from it. I mean, it sort of reminds me really that, you know, we all have a different view of what an archive is and what it might do for us and what we might be able to learn from it. And I think, and I hadn't expected at all to see that you were using it in that way. But of course, because you're a textile designer and that's your background and that's your specialism, of course that's what you wanted it for. You know, my background is more as a kind of furniture historian, really. So, in a way, the first part of your lecture seemed to me that, you know, we were going along a fairly, you know, standardized way of looking at an archive and learning about the history that it talks about. But of course, an archive like a Parker Knoll archive, the Frederick Parker archive, is very much a visual archive. It's a visual record of all sorts of designs and ideas and products and patterns. And I think what you did was actually very inspiring, very inspirational, to show us that actually an archive is a visual record as much as a historical record in this case, particularly, and that therefore, you know, you have a way of extracting from it something more than just in a sense just the dry history. So I think that was absolutely very inspirational, and I thank you very much for it. Now, there are some questions. So I'm going to go through the questions that are on the screen and read them out to you, and we can see. So the first one, I think, was actually typed in when I was doing my introduction. And someone says, is it true that no nail, this is an anonymous attendee at 613, he says, is it, or she, is it true that no nails were used, and it was an important part of its quality? Well, I mean, I don't know actually, because somebody else who knows more about the Frederick Parker and Parker Knoll way of making furniture would know more. But I don't think much in the way of furniture that a chair really requires much in the way of nailing, apart from nailing on the upholstery if you've got a braided or a piece of trimming that needs to be nailed on. Certainly the joints of a chair are cut as traditionally as mortise and tenon joints or something like that, and then they're glued. I don't think they're often held together with nails, but somebody else might know more. That's probably not really a question for you, Gina, I don't think. But, so I'm going let's move on. If anybody else has an answer to that, you can type it into the Q&A box. So then we have Dawn Durant. This is a question for you, Gina. She says, were Parker Knoll the first to use printed fabric?
I doubt it. I mean, screen printing was relatively new in the 1930s. Really came into its own a bit later when it was used for curtain fabric, because obviously the wovens are more robust, they will last longer, and then the prints would have been used more later when they were loose covers. So I can't say precisely. I mean, I can't think of any others that were using prints at that time, but I can't say for definite they were the first.
Yeah, I can't add anything to that at all. I'm not a textile historian, so I wouldn't know. But the technique of printing onto fabric was presumably known in the 19th century, and
Yes, I mean, there was block printing. There was a lot of block printing and some roller printing. So yes, I mean, there was an awful lot produced for garments, but not so much for upholstery.
I mean, the archives of companies like Sanderson's have amazing wooden blocks, printing blocks, incredible collection, and certainly some of those go right back to the middle of the 19th century, because there are blocks there designed by Pugin for the Palace of Westminster, Houses of Parliament, in wonderful sort of Gothic designs, and they were mostly, I suppose, for wallpapers, but some of the wallpapers were flock wallpapers, obviously, and I think they probably made probably made fabrics for curtains and wall hangings, perhaps, as well.
And GP&J Baker, particularly well known for that. Yes.
Yeah. So no, probably not the first, but they may have been in advance of doing. I think it was interesting that they were printing on linen as during the utility scheme as a way of producing colourful patterns in a very under the utility scheme, but to make them fairly affordable. So let's try another question. Thank you, Dawn. Angharad Halsey asks, is it possible to please have a copy of the images from the presentation? And she thanks you in advance. That's a question. I don't know how you could do that. You may have to email Gina directly for that, I think. And Gina, you might want to, we can add your email if you're happy to do that. We could add your email address to the information that's going to go out after this recorded session. Everybody who's attended will get an email giving them follow-up information of where to find further information. So that could include your email. That might be a way of doing that.
Yes, and it depends really what they're going to be used for. So obviously it's still part of my research, which is ongoing at the moment, and some of it's published and some of it isn't. So it depends sort of which images. And, yeah.
Copyright issues pertain. Yeah. Okay. Take another one. So Nicholas Springman, who just says, thank you for a fascinating lecture, which is very kind. That was done at 7:05. Martin Grierson asked, did PK Fabrics have any manufacturing facility, or were they all a selection from other textile companies? Were any designed by the PK design team?
Well, this is something that is ongoing research that I'm really interested in, and I believe they were all outsourced for manufacturing, that they worked with manufacturers, some in this country and some in Europe, particularly in Belgium, I understand. So they didn't have their own facilities as such.
No, and I don't know that they do even today. I think, of course, most furnishing companies that manufacture upholstered furniture would buy in their textiles from companies who were specialists in producing textiles, but they might well be commissioning particular designs, so having an influence on what the designs were.
Yes, definitely. They were working very closely with the manufacturers.
Yeah.
Over the designs. Yes.
And as you said, they seem to have a very canny understanding of what the public liked and wanted. So they were clever, and I think that part of the reason for that was that they were selling their own products. Most manufacturers were selling through retailers, so the retailers spoke to the customers. Parker Knoll was speaking to their own customers as well, so they would get direct feedback from all of their salespeople out on the road, and those ledgers that you showed of the salesman's record of the sales made were evidence of that sort of work. So it meant that they had a very direct contact with the people who were buying their furniture, And also that no doubt the retailers themselves had were as they are today, a sort of mine of information about customer preferences and moods and changes of ideas about what colors and fabrics and shapes and designs were fashionable at the time. So
yes,
yeah. Okay, so we've got 18 questions, and we're probably not going to get through them all, but we'll get through as many as we can. Next one is from Luke Honey. He says, hi, you mentioned Parker Knoll repro furniture in the 1930s and asked if they had tension springs. The answer is yes. I'm sitting in one now. So he's got a reproduction style chair made in the 1930s with tension springs. He says, thanks for the lecture. He enjoyed it. Luke Honey, Luke's obviously the one who's going to be giving us our lecture next week. So thanks, Luke.
Yes. I mean, I was pretty certain they would have the tension springing because they're called Parker Knoll. So, but I didn't want to say absolutely, not being an expert in that area of it. But I just thought that's so fascinating that it looks like the throne, this upholstered throne with tassels, has actually got this very innovative construction inside, completely disguised.
It's a good mixture, and actually that chair that you showed is I think very similar to, or the same as we have the original chair in the Frederick Parker collection. It's a late 17th or perhaps early 18th century chair. I think it's probably late 17th, but it's a wing chair, and they've obviously copied from that chair and then adapted it in order to make it work with the tension springing. So very interesting connections there. On to the next, we've got Dids McDonald. Hello, Dids. She says it's not really a question, other than to say clearly the archives of Frederick Parker have been a catalyst to bring other projects alive and relevant. The Big Blanket was such a wonderful way of bringing archive fabrics alive in a practical way. Congratulations, Gina. You have been inspiring. That's a very nice comment. One here from Gabrielle Falconer. Hello, Gabrielle. She says, tacks are used in traditional furniture upholstery. Most modern work uses adhesives extensively, but tacks still have their place. I think that's going back to the nails question. I thought the nails question was probably more about the construction of the furniture, but certainly you need nails to do upholstery. You're right about that one. Here's one from Martin Jordan. So Martin was chairman of Parker Knoll, so he knows exactly what he's talking about. He says Parker Knoll never used nails at any time. Maybe some of the lesser manufacturers sometimes did, but it was never recommended. So it obviously was a sign of quality, and that good quality furniture was joined by proper joints and not banged together with nails. I think certainly makes a lot of sense.
That's interesting.
Yeah. A question or a comment from Sarah Medlam. Good evening, Sarah. So she says printed chintzes were used for fixed upholstery by the late 18th century in both France and England. So we go right back into the 1700s with printed chintzes, which of course they were presumably sort of. And chintz was a word I think that was used as part of the trade in fabrics and textiles from through the East India Company, and so I think she's probably talking about chintzes that were produced inspired by textiles and printed woven designs that were imported from the Far East. I hope I got that right. A comment here from Stuart Linford. Hello, Stuart. He says, when we made thousands of chairs for the NHS, the mortise and tenon side rails were actually nailed through both parts of the joint with a nail gun to make the joint bomb-proof. Do you mean literally bomb-proof, or I don't know. But thanks, Stuart. Stuart obviously ran his own chair manufacturing company in High Wycombe for many years. So thank you, Stuart. A comment from Kristen Nye. I'm going to restore and reupholster a Parker Knoll 1960s modern chair as a stage 2 furniture upholstery student. Please can you advise the best places to purchase Parker Knoll fabric on its own? The website only signposts you to selecting fabric and furniture. Thank you. What do you think about that, Gina?
Well, the current Parker Knoll company, as he says, have this large range of fabrics. I mean, if he's talking about the archive fabrics, then they are archived. Then they're not produced, unless you can find something similar. But they're not produced as you see them as designs there.
Yeah, so you'd have to try and find something similar rather than trying to find the original. You won't find any original material, I don't think. And certainly, you know, we don't have that in the Frederick Parker collection. The little samples that you showed us from the books are sort of 2 inches square, so about as much as we can get. So that's but do direct your questions to the Parker Knoll company itself if you want to. They are very obliging, very helpful, and they'll certainly steer you in the right direction. A comment here from Lawrence Ridial, just a comment from a great grandson of Frederick Parker. Good evening, Lawrence. I remember my great uncle Harold, the youngest son of Frederick Parker, had nothing good to say about utility regulations, was pleased when they were over and PK could make comfortable chairs once more. Well, there we are. It was a funny time, wasn't it, when the government were very keen to introduce modernity to the consumer, the British consumer, and the British consumers were very reluctant to take it on, really.
Very resistant and reverted to what they really liked as soon as they could. Yes. Yeah.
And that was that, as you said in your lecture, that was the story right up until probably the 1980s and 90s, when young consumers began to really buy, I think, modern furniture. I mean, Habitat that had an amazing effect, I think, on young buyers, and then modern furniture becomes something that people really like. And of course, we're now into the sort of IKEA era where modern furniture and modernism is the first choice, and old traditional styles of furniture are really, and antiques particularly, are generally not very popular these days compared to how they were, 20, 30 years ago. So we have moved on into a modernist era, I think, but it's taken a long time.
I think it's to do with the prices as well, that because places like IKEA have driven the prices down, furniture's become another consumable that you don't feel you have to live with for 10 years, or you can throw it out perhaps. So I think that's changed the attitudes.
Just a couple more and then we're nearly at the end. Roger Waits asks, did Parker Knoll create Parker Tex? Do you know about Parker Tex?
Yes, so the Parker Knoll textiles became Parker Tex.
Right. As a company or as a brand?
As part of the overall Parker Knoll company. They were a division within it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's probably a research project all on its own, just to really unravel what the Parker Knoll Textile Company did. Question of Tony Dickens says, fascinating and inspirational, and thank you. Beatrice Goddard says, thank you for extending the invitation to this lecture to members of the Furniture History Society. Always pleased to help along. And Tom White. Tom White's in the design team. Hello, Tom. Good to hear from you. He says, hi, both. Tom White from the current Parker Knoll design team. We do indeed work very closely with fabric mills in the UK, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey, commissioning designs that are unique to us and continuing to evolve Parker Knoll as a brand. He says, many thanks for a fascinating lecture. Have you been in touch with Tom White? He must be one of the people you've been working with, I guess.
He is, yes.
Yeah. I think he leads the design team as far as I know. So
yes, and being very helpful with the live project.
Yeah, excellent. Ian Stevens says printed fabrics were also in production in the 13th century in China. Yeah. Well, yes, it's fascinating history of China that was so far advanced in many technologies, and completely hidden to the West until the 18th century, really. Elizabeth O'Neary says, "Thank you so much for sharing. I found it informative, interesting, and inspiring as I sit on my Parker Knoll." Very good. And Beta Barton Chapel says, "Found it very encouraging that archive founds and making of our living archive could be an inspiration for future generations. How can you advise to use them and learn from the past to continue our future?" Well, in a way, that was your lecture was about, wasn't it? About how to use things like archives for learning from the past. So, do you want to add anything about that, Gina?
Yes, I mean, I think if we do keep thinking of them as resources rather than something to be copied, because a lot of textile archives are used for commercial reproduction. So, I mean, this is what I'm interested in doing, and I hope there'll be more projects that show that they can be used creatively. But there does seem to need some kind of intervention, I think, between the archive and the public, so that it's not straightforward really in the way that you use an archiver. So I think this is why the more projects there are to demonstrate different ways of using it, then the more people an archive can reach. Different projects will appeal to different people.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we're doing with the London Metropolitan University is to get more and more digital content from the archive online. And of course, that's the way that everybody will then be able to access it. You said at the beginning, it's a little bit intimidating going to find your way into an archive and make an appointment and study it firsthand. Of course, studying firsthand is not, is the best way, but actually having access online leads you to wanting to go and see the objects themselves. But I think getting access online is really important, and we are busily trying to make sure there is more content online about both the archive and the chair collection. So more to come in that area.
Good.
So Donna's chief executive of Parker Knoll. So well done, Donna. She says, "David, the best route for current fabric purchases is via the Parker Knoll website, especially whilst retail is closed." So thank you, Donna. That was an answer to the question earlier about accessing fabrics. Marianne Forrest, great lecture. Great to see your great prints and the big blanket again. I hope this inspires visitors to come to London Metropolitan University to see the PK archives soon too. So that's somebody who you've been working with.
Yes. Hello, Marianne. Yes, thank you.
And Wendy Roberts says, "Great lecture, inspiring me as an upholsterer to rediscover my love of art history and my future designing and development." That's very good. And Debbie Johnson's the last one. I'm going to stop after this one. This is the last one. She says, "Did you leave the blanket makers to choose their own materials, and what was the most popular? Was it knitting or quilt squares?"
They could choose their own way of producing the blanket, and knitting was the most popular. So they just had to stick to the colours and the layout, the plan. But yeah, knitting was by far the most popular method for producing the blankets. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, Gina. Can I thank you on behalf of everybody who's listening in for a fascinating lecture and a talk which took us down all sorts of avenues and led us into seeing how your creativity is inspired and how you make best use of that, I think, and how you sharing your work with participants at every stage was very inclusive and actually led to some rather wonderful discoveries of your own. And I do think the big blanket, I hope it gets a lot of publicity, or did get a lot of publicity when it was done, but that's a fantastic project. And it is lovely to see the archive being used in that way. And I hope, and I'm sure it will, inspire others to come along and dig into the archive and to find the kind of things that they're looking for and come away as inspired as you obviously have been. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to share my screen now, so you can mute yourself and turn your video off.
Yeah.
And I just want to share my screen with the final slide, which is here. Not that one, but that will be in a minute. So, in this final slide gives you all of you at home listening in a little bit of information. It thanks you for attending. If you'd like to donate, of course, the Frederick Parker collection is looked after by the Furniture Makers Company, which is a charity, and we do our best to look after the collection in the best way we can. But every penny that we raise to do that job, it goes straight into looking after the chairs and looking after the archive and putting more material online so it can be used for educational purposes. So we really would like you to help us in that if you can, and there's an easy and quick way to do it just by texting to that number. But I want to particularly thank people who helped to put this event together this evening, especially Christopher Claxton-Stevens, Sally Kent and George Cooper. A very special thanks to Gina for a wonderful lecture, and then not least to all of you who have joined us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it an interesting lecture and an interesting evening. And if you'd like to support the Frederick Parker collection with a donation, you can do so here. And if you want to join the Friends, you'll hear more about the Friends at the next lecture on the 1st of April, when Martin joins us to do the champagne draw. But if you'd like to join the Friends, that's a very good way of supporting the collection, and details of that are on the Furniture Makers website. And you will get details sent to you as an email in the next couple of days, giving you a link to further information, but also sending a link to the recorded version of this lecture. And it simply remains for me now to wish you all well and say thank you very much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you in a week's time. Good night. Thank you.